a husband, a wife, and their new friends. What starts as an innocent dinner leads to an explosive secret that could destroy everything. Stay tuned to see how one night changes everything. My wife. Sarah's eyes sparkled as she waved a glossy brochure in front of me. The pamphlet showcased a lavish new resort nestled along the California coast. I could see the excitement in her face, but skepticism crept in as I imagined the price tag attached to such luxury. I knew that lately, we hadn't had the best financial luck. But Sarah quickly explained that her PR agency was handling the resort's publicity campaign, and we had been offered a free stay at the exclusive Blue Horizon Resort. She suggested that it might be a great way to reconnect and spend quality time together, something we hadn't done in far too long. I was hesitant at first. There was a big soccer match I had been looking forward to watching that weekend, and part of me felt guilty about spending time away from work when my construction business was finally beginning to pick up. But I realized that our 8-year marriage had been strained recently. My mind constantly preoccupied with the business and the financial hit we took when we had to sell our house. With Sarah working long hours at her PR firm, it felt like we were slowly drifting apart. She had been the one holding us together during the tough times. Her rising career and constant success meant late nights and less time for us, which put extra strain on our relationship. Perhaps this getaway was exactly what we needed. We packed on a Wednesday night and left Austin early Thursday morning, heading to Blue Horizon Resort, where I hoped we could finally get back to how things used to be. As we arrived, the remote location of the resort surprised me, but I was even more impressed by its luxurious surroundings. Sarah had clearly worked her PR magic because the ocean view suite they had assigned us was nothing short of breathtaking. After we unpacked, Sarah suggested we grab mojitos at the resort bar, and we spent the afternoon talking and joking like we hadn't done in a long time. It felt refreshing, like we were reconnecting after all the chaos of life back home. Later, while Sarah went for a massage at the spa, I decided to take a swim. After a few laps in the heated pool, I started to relax and let the stress melt away. I even took a nap afterward, feeling hopeful about the weekend ahead. That evening, we got dressed for dinner, but to our disappointment, the resort's restaurant was fully booked. Just as we were about to head to another dining spot, a man at a nearby table waved us over. He had a confident presence, a man probably around my age, but perhaps a bit more polished. "I noticed you were looking for a table," he said, walking up to us. "I'm Brad Collins, and this is my wife, Laura. If you don't mind dining with strangers, we'd love for you to join us." I looked at Sarah, who smiled and shrugged, seemingly interested in the idea. "I'm Jake, and this is my wife, Sarah. We'd be happy to join you." We moved to their table and immediately began to size each other up. Brad was about my height, but more muscular, his wealth apparent in his tailored clothes. His wife, Laura, was stunning, with a confident demeanor that demanded attention. She wasn't just another trophy wife. Her charm and sophistication made that clear from the start. Dinner was pleasant, filled with conversation about the resort and our lives. Brad and Laura had only just arrived from Fresno, and we shared some of our first impressions of the place. As the night wore on, Brad insisted on ordering after-dinner drinks, and we raised our glasses in a toast to new friends and unexpected adventures. Just as we were finishing dessert, Brad looked at us with a mischievous glint in his eyes. "There's a nightclub here, and I hear it's quite the experience. How about we head over for a few dances?" Sarah smiled at me, clearly interested, and after a moment I nodded. "Sure, why not?" The nightclub was already packed when we arrived, the dim lighting and upbeat music giving it a lively, almost electric atmosphere. Brad must have had some connections because, despite the crowd, a table was opened for us almost immediately. We ordered drinks, and just as I was about to take a sip, Brad stood up with a grin. "Mind if I take your wife for a dance?" he asked, his tone casual but bold. I hesitated for a split second, but Sarah shot me a playful look, clearly up for the idea. "Only if I can dance with yours," I replied, trying to keep it light. Laura gave me an approving smile, and soon enough, we were on the dance floor. The band played some classic rock, and after a couple of songs, Brad and I switched partners. I found myself dancing with Laura, who moved with an effortless grace. There was something captivating about her. She was magnetic, exuding confidence and charm with every step. By the time we returned to our table, Sarah leaned into me with a playful glint in her eye. "Ready to head back?" she whispered, giving me a wink. "We've got some unfinished business in our room." I grinned, nodding in agreement. The night had been fun, but I was ready to spend some time alone with my wife. We said our goodbyes to Brad and Laura, but as we were leaving, Brad called out after us. "Hey, why don't you two join us for brunch tomorrow at our beach cottage? It's at 11. I think you'll love it." I looked at Sarah, who whispered in my ear, "I really like them, and I'd love to check out one of those cottages." "Sure," I replied, turning back to Brad. "We'll see you tomorrow." As Sarah and I got into the elevator to head back to our room, she turned to me with a teasing smile. "So, what did you think of Laura?" she asked, her tone playful. "She seemed nice," I said, trying to keep my answer simple, but Sarah wasn't buying it. "Nice, huh? You couldn't stop staring at her," she teased, her eyes sparkling with amusement. I opened my mouth to protest, but she just laughed and leaned in closer. "Well, I think it's time you paid some attention to me instead," she said, gesturing toward herself. "They might not be as big as hers, but I think you'll appreciate them just the same if you give them a little kiss." That was all the encouragement I needed. We spent the rest of the night in a way we hadn't in a long time. Intimate, connected, like we had rediscovered something we thought we'd lost. The next morning we made our way to Brad and Laura's beach cottage for brunch. The place was incredible, modern, sleek, and right on the water, with an infinity pool overlooking the ocean. The cool ocean breeze made everything feel perfect, and I could tell that Sarah was loving every second of it. While Sarah and Laura decided to lounge by the pool, Brad invited me to join him for a fishing trip aboard his boat. I wasn't much of a fisherman, but the idea of being out on the water was appealing, so I agreed. We grabbed a cooler of beer, and before long, we were cruising a few miles out into the Pacific. The fish weren't biting much, but the cold drinks and relaxing atmosphere made up for it. Brad shared stories about his wealth and success, and I couldn't help but be impressed. He was a self-made man who had built his empire from the ground up, and his confidence was contagious. Suddenly, my fishing rod jerked violently. I struggled to reel in what felt like a massive catch, and Brad came over to help. As we worked together, he pointed out something in the water. There was a shark nearby. It leaped out of the water several times as I fought to pull in the line, but eventually, the fish got away. "Losing a big one like that is part of the game," Brad said, patting me on the back. "But you'll get the next one." By the time we got back to the resort, I was exhausted, but excited to share the adventure with Sarah. When I told her about the near catch, she was impressed, but I could sense there was something else on her mind. After a moment of silence, Sarah finally spoke, her expression unreadable. "Laura and I had an interesting conversation by the pool today." "Yeah?" I asked, curious about what had transpired. She told me something about her and Brad. "They're into swinging." Sarah paused, watching for my reaction. "Swinging?" I asked, confused at first. "What do they like to swing?" Sarah sighed, giving me a look that said I was being naive. "No, Jake, they swap partners. In bed." The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. "Oh, I didn't see that coming." "There's more," Sarah continued, a sly smile creeping across her face. "Laura asked if we'd be interested in joining them tonight." I stared at her, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. We had only just met these people, and now this? Sure, Laura was attractive, but wasn't this trip supposed to be about reconnecting with Sarah, not complicating things further? "I don't know, honey," I began, trying to gather my thoughts. "I like them, but this feels a little rushed." "What do you think?" Sarah sat down next to me, her hand resting on mine, her expression thoughtful. "I think we should go for it. We've talked about experimenting before, and this seems like the perfect opportunity. We don't really know them that well, and they live in another state. It's not like we'll run into them again. Plus, let's be honest, Laura is gorgeous." The image of Laura from the day before flashed through my mind, making the idea more tempting than I wanted to admit. But I needed to be sure Sarah was truly comfortable with this. "Are you sure?" I asked, squeezing her hand gently. "We're having a great weekend, and I'm more than happy to just focus on you." Sarah smiled warmly, her confidence steady. I'm sure, Jake. Let's do it. It'll be an adventure, and if it doesn't feel right, we never have to do it again. Her certainty, combined with my growing attraction to Laura, pushed me toward agreeing. I masked my excitement as best as I could, but I was already curious about how the night would unfold. At dinner with Brad and Laura that evening, the air was charged with anticipation. Sarah wore a red dress that clung to her figure, and Laura, dressed in black, was equally stunning. As the night progressed, the glances and touches between all of us became more daring, the atmosphere thick with unspoken intentions. After dinner, when the women suggested dancing, Brad and I reluctantly agreed. The slow jazz that played in the background only intensified the closeness between us. Laura pressed against me, her touch now impossible to ignore. While across the dance floor, I saw Brad and Sarah in a similarly intimate embrace. As the night wore on, Brad leaned over to me during a break between dances and slipped me his keycard. You and Laura can use our cottage tonight, he said with a wink. Sarah and I will stay in yours. I nodded, my pulse quickening at the thought. When the women returned from freshening up, the evening continued to escalate. Laura's subtle touches became more deliberate, and the tension between us was undeniable. Back at their beach cottage, things moved quickly. Laura led me to the bedroom, her hands eager as she undressed me. The experience was intense, unlike anything I had ever imagined. Afterward, as I lay there, catching my breath, I realized she had curled up beside me, her body warm against mine. I turned and kissed her gently, still reeling from the intensity of the moment. That was unexpected, I admitted, surprised by how good it had felt. Laura smiled seductively, her eyes half-lidded with satisfaction. You're full of surprises, Jake. Come on, big guy, she said, positioning herself closer. Let's see what else you've got. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of waves crashing against the shore outside the cottage. Laura stirred beside me, stretching languidly before reminding me that we had brunch plans. I got dressed, still a little groggy and disoriented from the night before, but eager to see Sarah and talk about what had happened. When we arrived at the restaurant, Sarah and Brad were already seated. Sarah greeted me with a bright smile, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. How was your night? She asked, her tone light and playful. It was good, I replied cautiously, unsure of how much to say in front of Brad. We'll talk about it later. She nodded, but before I could say more, she urged me to eat. You look exhausted. Get some food in you first. As we dug into our meal, the conversation turned to lighter topics, plans for the day, upcoming trips, and the weather. Brad and Laura seemed relaxed, and while there was a certain tension between us, it wasn't uncomfortable. After brunch, Laura suggested we take the boat out for a ride. Brad couldn't join us because of a conference call, but he assured us that Laura was more than capable of handling the boat on her own. The idea of spending the afternoon out on the water sounded appealing, so Sarah and I agreed. We headed back to our room to change into beachwear. I noticed that as we packed up our gear, a wave of exhaustion hit me. I yawned, rubbing my eyes. Sarah noticed immediately. You look beat, Jake. Why don't you take a quick nap? Laura and I will go ahead, and you can join us later. I didn't need much convincing. I collapsed onto the bed, barely hearing Sarah kiss me on the cheek and place a do not disturb sign on the door before she left with Laura. I passed out almost instantly. What felt like moments later, I was jolted awake by loud knocking and frantic voices outside. Groggy and disoriented, I glanced at the clock. It was already 4 p.m., much later than I expected. The knocking persisted, and I stumbled to the door, opening it to find a hotel staff member looking alarmed. We've been searching for you, he said urgently. There's been an accident. My mind struggled to process his words. An accident? What kind of accident? A boat explosion, he replied, his voice grim. The Coast Guard is out there now, but it doesn't look good. Panic surged through me. Whose boat? I asked, my voice shaky. A Chris Craft cruiser, the staff member responded, his tone serious. There's debris, and it's unclear if there are any survivors. The Coast Guard hasn't spotted anyone yet. My heart dropped. Laura and Sarah were on that boat. My mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of what he was saying. Without thinking, I followed him, running to the shore where several people had already gathered, watching the rescue efforts from a distance. Smoke was rising from the water, and I could see helicopters circling overhead. A Coast Guard officer approached me, his expression serious. "Are you Jake Turner?" he asked. I nodded, barely able to speak. "My wife, Sarah, and her friend Laura, they were on that boat." The officer's face softened with sympathy. "We haven't found any life vests, and the divers haven't recovered any bodies yet, but we're doing everything we can." I felt the ground shift beneath me, my legs weakening under the weight of the situation. The officer added, "A boat from the Marine Safety Office in San Diego is on its way to conduct a more detailed search." The officer's words echoed in my mind as I stood there, staring at the water, trying to make sense of what was happening. My head was spinning, my heart racing. I could barely breathe as I watched the Coast Guard's efforts from the shore, the smoke from the wreckage still visible in the distance. "Please, no," I whispered to myself, trying to push away the terrible thoughts. Sarah had to be okay. They both had to be okay. There was no way this could be happening. The officer turned to leave but stopped before walking away. "If we hear anything, you'll be the first to know," he said, his voice low. "I'm sorry, sir." I barely nodded in response, my legs trembling as I made my way back to the hotel. As I entered the lobby, I overheard some of the other guests whispering to each other. "Poor guy. His wife was on that boat," one woman muttered to her friend. I walked past them, trying to block out the growing pit of dread inside me. I reached my room and collapsed onto the bed, my mind consumed by the thought that Sarah might never come back. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and tried calling her, straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice barely steady. "Sarah, it's Jake. I'm here at the hotel. Please call me as soon as you can. I need to know you're okay. I love you." I hung up, staring at the phone in my hand, willing it to ring. It didn't. Minutes dragged on, feeling like hours. I tried to distract myself by calling my office and checking on some projects, but it was useless. My mind kept returning to the wreckage in the water and the horrible possibility that Sarah might be gone forever. A hotel staff member knocked on the door later that evening, bringing food sent by the manager. But I had no appetite. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I paced the room, trying to hold myself together, but the weight of my fear was crushing me. As night fell, I found myself staring out at the dark ocean from the balcony, praying for any sign of hope. Sleep was impossible, and I spent the entire night wide awake, waiting for news that never came. At some point in the early morning, I must have dozed off because I was startled awake by a loud knock at the door. I rushed to open it, and standing there was a Coast Guard officer, his expression grim. "We're calling off the search for survivors," he said quietly. "We've used all of our equipment through the night, but given the severity of the explosion, the chances of finding anyone alive are slim." I stared at him, unable to comprehend his words. I wanted to scream, to beg them to keep looking, but I knew deep down that it wouldn't change anything. "I'm sorry," the officer said, his voice filled with sympathy. "If you need anything, we're here to help." I nodded, my throat tight, and watched as he left. The door closed, and I collapsed onto the floor, my body shaking with grief. Sarah was gone. She was really gone. The hours that followed were a blur of sorrow and guilt. I couldn't stop thinking about our last night together, the way she had smiled at me, the way she had teased me. And then the thought hit me like a punch to the gut. I had spent Sarah's last night alive in the arms of another woman. I hated myself for it. The guilt was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the image of Sarah laughing with Laura, completely unaware of what would happen the next day. If I had been on the boat with her, maybe I could have done something. Maybe I could have saved her. My thoughts turned to Brad. He was probably going through the same torment, wondering what had happened to Laura. I considered reaching out to him, but the thought of facing him in this state felt impossible. I was consumed by grief, guilt, and anger. It was the worst night of my life. The next morning, I received a knock at the door. Two men in uniform stood outside. One of them introduced himself as Detective Larson from the Austin Police Department. The other was from the Citrus County Sheriff's Office. "Mr. Turner, we need to ask you some questions about the incident," Larson said, his tone serious. I sighed, stepping aside to let them in. The last thing I wanted to deal with was an investigation, but I knew it was necessary. We sat down in the small living area of the suite, and Larson began asking the routine questions. "Where were you when the explosion occurred?" "I was in my room," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "From breakfast until about 4 p.m. I was asleep." "That's a long nap," Larson remarked, his tone skeptical. "What were you doing in your room all that time?" "Napping," I said, a wave of irritation creeping into my voice. "I was tired from the night before." The detective raised an eyebrow. "So, no one can confirm your whereabouts between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m.? I clenched my jaw, trying to stay calm. "No, I was alone." Larson scribbled something in his notebook before glancing up at me. "Mr. Turner, your wife just died in a tragic accident, but the circumstances surrounding the explosion are suspicious. We need to know everything you can remember." I felt a surge of anger. "Suspicious? What are you suggesting?" The second officer spoke up, his tone condescending. "We're simply following all leads, Mr. Turner. We need to ensure nothing was overlooked." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "Officers, I'm fully aware of my rights. I'll be happy to cooperate, but I won't answer any more questions without my lawyer present." The two men exchanged glances before the detective closed his notebook. "Very well. We'll expect you at the sheriff's office tomorrow morning." After the detectives left, I immediately called my lawyer, Alan Pierce, a well-regarded attorney in Austin who had helped me through some business matters before. His secretary recognized my voice and transferred me directly to him. "Jake," Alan said as soon as he picked up, his tone laced with concern. "I heard about the accident. I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thanks, Alan," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "But I need your help. The detectives came by and started treating me like a suspect. I told them I wouldn't answer any more questions without a lawyer." "You did the right thing," Alan said firmly. "I'll be there with you tomorrow. Don't worry, Jake. We'll handle this." After hanging up, I felt a slight sense of relief, but it was short-lived. The weight of Sarah's death was still unbearable. And now, on top of everything, I had to deal with being treated as a suspect. I couldn't believe it. How had my life spiraled so far out of control? The rest of the day passed in a haze. I tried to keep myself busy, contacting Sarah's parents and breaking the devastating news to them. It was one of the hardest phone calls I'd ever had to make. Her mother broke down in tears, and I could hear her father struggling to keep his composure. They wanted answers, but I had none to give. I spent the evening packing up our things, trying to stay occupied. But every time I found a piece of Sarah's clothing or a personal item of hers, the grief came rushing back, suffocating me. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with thoughts of what had happened and what was to come. The next morning, I met Alan at the Citrus County Sheriff's Office. He was a tall, confident man in his early 50s, with graying hair and a no-nonsense attitude. As we walked into the building, I felt a sense of dread. I had no idea what the detectives were planning to throw at me. We were escorted into a small, sterile interrogation room, where Detective Larson and the local sheriff, Sheriff Grayson, were waiting. The sheriff was an older man with a stern expression, his demeanor calm but intense. "Mr. Turner," Sheriff Grayson began, "we appreciate you coming in today. We have a few more questions regarding the explosion." Alan stepped in immediately. "My client is here to cooperate fully, but we'll need to make sure the questioning is fair and within bounds." The sheriff nodded, seemingly unbothered by the presence of my lawyer. "Of course. Let's start with the events of that morning. Can you confirm that you were alone in your room during the hours of 10 a.m. to 4 p.m.? I glanced at Alan, who gave me a reassuring nod before I answered. "Yes, I was asleep in my room. I was tired from the night before." "And you didn't leave your room at all during that time?" Grayson pressed, his eyes narrowing slightly. "No," I replied firmly. "I didn't." Sheriff Grayson scribbled something in his notebook before looking back up at me. It's just that none of the hotel staff remember seeing you during those hours, and given the circumstances, we have to be thorough. Were you aware of your wife's whereabouts during that time? I hesitated for a moment, the memory of the previous night flashing in my mind. She was with Laura Collins, I said, keeping my tone even. They went out on Brad's boat. And how well do you know Brad and Laura Collins? The sheriff asked, his voice a bit sharper now. We met them during our stay, I replied. I didn't know them before this trip. Did you know that Mr. Collins has a history of legal issues? Grayson asked, raising an eyebrow. That caught me off guard. No, I didn't. Alan shifted beside me. Sheriff, unless you have concrete evidence that my client is involved in something criminal, I'd advise we move on. Sheriff Grayson didn't flinch. This is just a routine line of questioning, Mr. Pierce. We have reason to believe there may have been foul play involved in the explosion. My stomach dropped. Foul play? What are you saying? Larson leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. We're saying that the explosion wasn't an accident. Preliminary reports indicate that the boat's engine was tampered with, likely to cause the explosion. We're trying to determine who had the motive and the opportunity to do such a thing. I felt my pulse quicken. You think someone deliberately caused the explosion? That's what we're investigating, Grayson replied, his eyes locking onto mine. Alan cut in, his voice firm. My client has already stated that he was in his room the entire time, with no knowledge of any sabotage. Unless you're prepared to charge him with a crime, we'll be leaving. There was a tense silence in the room before the sheriff finally nodded. You're free to go, Mr. Turner. But don't leave town. We may have more questions. Alan and I left the station, and as soon as we were outside, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Alan, what the hell is going on? Someone sabotaged the boat. It looks like it, Alan said grimly. But don't worry, Jake. They don't have anything on you. We just need to stay calm and let them do their job. Over the next few days, the investigation into the explosion continued, but I stayed as far away from it as possible. I didn't want to think about who might have tampered with the boat or why. All I could focus on was my grief and the overwhelming guilt that consumed me every time I thought about Sarah. I spent hours at the hotel, replaying the events of that fateful day in my mind. Was there something I missed? Some sign that this was all a setup? I thought about Brad's wealth and influence, wondering if he had enemies I didn't know about. But then my thoughts would shift back to Sarah, and I would be overcome with sorrow again. One afternoon, as I sat on the balcony, staring out at the ocean, my phone rang. It was Alan. Jake, I've got some news, he said, his voice steady, but serious. The sheriff's office found fuel cans washed ashore near the wreckage. They've got your fingerprints on them. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. My fingerprints. But I didn't touch any fuel cans. You said you helped Brad prepare the boat, right? Maybe you handled them then, Alan suggested. Yeah. I guess I did, I replied, my mind racing. But that doesn't mean I did anything wrong. I know that, Jake, Alan said calmly. But it's not a good look. We need to get ahead of this. I'll be in touch with the sheriff's office, and we'll handle it. The days after Alan's call felt like a blur. My mind couldn't stop racing, replaying every interaction with Brad, every moment on that boat, and wondering how things could have gone so wrong. The fact that my fingerprints were on the fuel cans made me uneasy. I knew I had touched them while helping Brad with the boat, but would the authorities see it that way? Alan kept reassuring me that everything would be fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being set up. The sheriff's office hadn't officially accused me of anything, but it felt like they were circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. I couldn't focus on anything else. I'd try to return to my usual routines, but nothing felt normal anymore. My grief over Sarah's death was still raw, and the investigation hanging over my head made it impossible to move forward. A week after the fuel can discovery, I received another call from Alan, but this time his tone was more urgent. Jake, We need to talk, he said, cutting straight to the point. I just spoke with the sheriff's office again. They've found additional evidence, and it's not looking good. My stomach churned. What evidence? They've reviewed the resort's surveillance footage and logs. They claim there's no proof that you were in your room the entire time. None of the cameras caught you entering or leaving, and no staff saw you during the critical hours. I gripped the phone tighter, my pulse racing. But I was in my room. I slept through most of the day. I know, Jake. But right now, they're focusing on the gaps in your alibi. It's circumstantial, but it's enough to raise questions, Alan said, his voice steady but serious. I slumped down into the nearest chair, feeling the walls close in. What do we do now? I've already contacted a private investigator to help us gather more evidence. There has to be something that proves you were in your room. We'll also look into the boat's history and Brad's background more thoroughly. We need to widen the scope here. I nodded, though Alan couldn't see me. Do you think Brad could have set me up? Alan paused. It's possible. We can't rule anything out. But for now, just keep your head down, and let's get to work on clearing your name. With Alan working on my defense, I tried to focus on figuring out what really happened. I couldn't let myself believe that Brad was innocent anymore. There were too many strange coincidences, too many things that didn't add up. I started digging into Brad's past, using what little information I had about him. What I found only deepened my suspicion. Brad had been involved in several shady business deals over the years. He had faced lawsuits, accusations of fraud, and rumors of unethical practices. But somehow, none of it had ever stuck. He always seemed to come out clean, his wealth and power protecting him from any real consequences. Could Brad have been behind the explosion? Could he have planned all of this to cover up something bigger? The more I thought about it, the more plausible it seemed. But why involve me? And what about Laura? Was she a part of this too? I needed answers, and I needed them fast. One evening, as I sat in my hotel room, my phone rang again. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer it. Jake Turner? A female voice asked on the other end of the line. Yes. Who's this? My name's Gina Clark. I'm a private investigator hired by Alan Pierce to help with your case. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Thank God. I need all the help I can get. Listen, I've been digging into Brad Collins's background, and I've found some things that might interest you, she continued. But first, I need to meet with you in person. There's too much to discuss over the phone. Where and when? I asked, eager to learn more. Let's meet tomorrow morning at a coffee shop near the resort. There's one called Coastal Brew just off the main road. Does 10 a.m. work for you? Yeah, I'll be there, I replied, feeling a strange mix of anxiety and hope. The next morning, I made my way to Coastal Brew, feeling a growing sense of urgency. I didn't know what Gina had uncovered, but if it could help prove my innocence, I needed to hear it. I arrived at the cafe a few minutes early and grabbed a table in the corner. Not long after, a woman in her mid-30s with sharp features and a no-nonsense expression walked in. She scanned the room before locking eyes with me and heading over. You must be Jake, she said, offering a quick handshake before sitting down across from me. Gina, right? I said, trying to keep my nerves in check. What did you find? She pulled a manila folder from her bag and set it on the table. Brad Collins isn't who you think he is. His entire public persona is a front. Behind the scenes, he's been involved in some pretty shady operations. Offshore accounts, illegal financial schemes, and most importantly, connections to some very dangerous people. My heart skipped a beat. So, you think he set me up? It's more complicated than that, Gina replied, flipping through the folder. Brad is the kind of guy who uses people to get what he wants. He's had run-ins with law enforcement before, but nothing ever stuck because he was always 2 steps ahead. That's why I think this whole thing was orchestrated by him. He knew you would be an easy target to divert attention from whatever he was really doing. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what she was saying. But why would he go through all this trouble? What's his endgame? Gina slid a photograph across the table. It was a picture of Brad and Laura, but they weren't alone. They were with a group of men, all of whom looked like they meant serious business. "See that guy in the middle?" she asked, pointing to one of the men in the photo. "That's Victor Malone, one of the biggest money launderers on the West Coast. Brad has been in bed with him for years. My guess? The explosion was meant to cover up something much bigger. A deal gone wrong, maybe. But with Laura dead, it changes the whole game." My mind was spinning. "So, you think Brad sabotaged the boat to kill Laura?" "It's possible," Gina said, her expression grim. "And it's also possible that he's trying to make it look like you were the one behind it. We need more evidence. But this connection to Malone is huge." "What do we do next?" I asked, feeling a mix of dread and determination. "We keep digging. I'll keep working on uncovering more about Brad's connections and what he's really up to. In the meantime, stay low. And don't do anything that could make you look guilty. We're going to prove that you're innocent, Jake." Gina's revelations weighed heavily on my mind as I left the cafe. The idea that Brad had orchestrated this entire scheme, that he had ties to dangerous criminals like Victor Malone, made everything clearer and yet far more complicated. If Brad was trying to cover his tracks by framing me, then I was up against something far more dangerous than just a botched boat explosion. Back at the hotel, I called Alan to update him on what Gina had discovered. He was quiet as I explained Brad's connections to Malone, and when I finished, he sighed. "This complicates things, Jake," Alan said, his tone serious. "If Brad is involved with someone like Malone, we need to tread carefully. We're no longer dealing with just a legal issue. This could get much more dangerous." "I know," I replied, the weight of his words settling in. "But what do we do now? We can't just sit back and wait for the sheriff to arrest me." "We need to get ahead of this," Alan said, his voice steady. "I'll reach out to a contact I have in federal law enforcement. If Malone's involved, this might fall under federal jurisdiction, and we might be able to get more resources on our side. In the meantime, Gina needs to keep digging. We need more proof of Brad's involvement, something concrete." "Okay," I agreed. "But what if Brad catches wind of what we're doing? He could get desperate." "That's a risk we'll have to take," Alan said grimly. "But we don't have a choice. We need to bring all of this to light before it's too late." The next few days were a blur of tension and waiting. Gina continued her investigation, working around the clock to uncover more details about Brad's dealings with Malone and his potential motive for sabotaging the boat. I spent most of my time laying low, avoiding any contact with Brad, and trying not to draw attention to myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Brad had been eerily quiet since the explosion, and I hadn't heard a word from him. The fact that he wasn't reaching out or trying to clear the air only made me more suspicious. Something was brewing, and I had a sinking feeling that it was about to get worse. One afternoon, while I was at the hotel trying to distract myself with mindless TV, Gina called. Her voice was urgent. "Jake, you need to meet me. Now." "Where?" I asked, my heart racing. "I'll text you the address. Be there in 20 minutes. She hung up before I could ask any more questions. A few moments later, a text popped up with an address, a quiet bar on the outskirts of town, far from the tourist-heavy areas near the resort. I grabbed my jacket and headed out, my mind racing with possibilities. Whatever Gina had found, it had to be big. But I also knew that meeting in such a low-key place meant that she was trying to stay under the radar. That only made me more nervous. When I arrived at the bar, Gina was already sitting at a corner table, a stack of papers in front of her. She looked up as I approached, her expression serious. "Thanks for coming," she said, motioning for me to sit. "I found something that changes everything." I sat down, my pulse quickening. "What is it?" Gina slid a sheet of paper across the table. It was a bank statement, one of Brad's offshore accounts by the looks of it. My eyes scanned the numbers, but I didn't understand the significance until Gina pointed to a particular transaction. "Look at this," she said, her finger resting on a transfer of several $1,000,000. This money was moved the day after the explosion, and it wasn't a payout to Brad. It was a payment to Malone's organization. I stared at the paper, trying to wrap my head around what this meant. So, Brad paid Malone? "Exactly," Gina said, her voice low. But here's the kicker. This isn't just a payoff. It's hush money. Brad is paying Malone to keep something quiet, likely his involvement in the explosion. He's trying to make sure that Malone's people don't talk, that no one finds out what really happened. My stomach twisted. So Brad's covering his tracks and framing me in the process. Gina nodded. It looks that way. This money trail is the key to proving that Brad had a motive to sabotage the boat. He needed to silence Malone's people before they turned on him. And you were just collateral damage in his plan. I felt a surge of anger rise within me. So what do we do now? We take this to the authorities, Gina said firmly. But not just the local sheriff. This is too big for them to handle. We need to go to the feds. Later that evening, Gina and I met with Alan, and we laid everything out for him. The bank statement, the money transfer, Brad's connections to Malone. Alan listened intently, his expression growing more serious with every piece of evidence we presented. This is big, Alan said after we finished. If we can get the feds involved, we might be able to flip this whole case on Brad. But it's going to take time. We don't have time, I said, the frustration boiling over. The sheriff is still breathing down my neck, and Brad could be planning his next move right now. Alan nodded. I know. But we need to make sure we're fully prepared before we go to the feds. If we rush this, Brad could slip through the cracks and we'd lose our only chance to clear your name. Gina spoke up. I've got a contact in the FBI. He might be able to speed things along. If I can get him on board, we could have the feds investigating Brad by the end of the week. Do it, Alan said. And in the meantime, Jake, keep a low profile. The last thing we need is for Brad to catch wind of what we're doing. I nodded, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I just want this to be over. I want justice for Sarah. We're getting closer, Gina said, her voice steady. But we need to be smart about this. We're dealing with dangerous people. One wrong move, and this could get a lot worse. The next few days felt like a pressure cooker. Gina worked tirelessly to get her FBI contact involved, while Alan prepared our case to take to the federal authorities. I did my best to stay out of sight, avoiding any interaction with Brad or the local sheriff's office. Then, one night, everything came to a head. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep but failing miserably. My mind kept racing with thoughts of Sarah, of Brad, of everything that had gone wrong. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at my door. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with Brad. He was standing there, his usual smug grin plastered across his face. But there was something different in his eyes. Something darker, more threatening. Brad, I said, my voice tight. What are you doing here? He leaned against the doorframe casually, as if we were just two old friends having a late-night chat. I thought we should talk, Jake. Things have gotten a little tense, don't you think? I could feel my pulse quicken. Every instinct screamed at me to slam the door in his face, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. Brad wasn't here for a friendly chat, and whatever he wanted, it wasn't good. What do you want, Brad? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Brad's smile widened. Relax. I'm not here to cause trouble. In fact, I'm here to help. Help? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How do you figure that? He stepped inside, uninvited, and I instinctively took a step back. Look, Jake, we've both had a rough couple of weeks. I get it. You're grieving, and you're probably angry. But I don't want things to get out of hand. I don't want you to do something you'll regret. I narrowed my eyes, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. Out of hand? You mean like framing me for a murder I didn't commit? Brad's grin faltered for a moment before he quickly regained his composure. Framing you? Come on, Jake. That's a pretty strong accusation. We're both smarter than that, aren't we? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my anger in check. Cut the crap, Brad. I know about the money. I know about Malone. You think you can just waltz in here and intimidate me into backing down? Brad's expression hardened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think I do," I said, stepping closer to him. "Gina found everything. The bank transfers, the connection to Malone. It's all falling apart for you, Brad." He blinked, and for a moment, I thought I saw his facade crack. But then, just as quickly, his arrogant grin returned. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? Let me give you a piece of advice, Jake. Be careful who you trust. This world isn't as black and white as you think." I stared him down, refusing to let him rattle me. "You've already lost, Brad. It's just a matter of time before the feds come knocking." Brad chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You really think the FBI is going to save you? You have no idea who you're dealing with. Malone has connections in places you can't even imagine. If you think a couple of bank statements are going to take him down, you're in for a rude awakening." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't let it show. "I'm not scared of you, and I'm not scared of Malone." "You should be," Brad said, his voice low and dangerous. "Because if you keep pushing, you're going to end up just like Sarah." That did it. I snapped. Before I could stop myself, I lunged at him, grabbing him by the collar and shoving him against the wall. "What did you just say?" I growled, my face inches from his. Brad's grin finally disappeared, replaced by genuine fear. "Hey, calm down," he said, raising his hands in surrender. "I didn't mean—" "You're going to pay for what you did to her," I spat, my voice shaking with rage. "You think you can just walk in here and threaten me? You're done, Brad. It's over." I let go of his collar, shoving him away from me. Brad straightened his shirt, trying to regain his composure, but I could see that the confidence had drained from his face. "You've made a big mistake, Jake," he said, his voice quieter now, more menacing. "You're in way over your head." "Get out," I said through gritted teeth. "Get out, and don't ever come near me again." Brad hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You'll regret this," he muttered before turning and walking out the door. I stood there for a long time after he left, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that Brad wasn't bluffing. He was desperate, and desperate people did dangerous things. But I also knew that I couldn't back down now, not after everything he had done. The next morning, I called Gina and Alan and told them about Brad's late-night visit. They both agreed that things were escalating and that we needed to act fast. Gina's contact at the FBI had finally agreed to take a closer look at the case, and we were preparing to hand over all the evidence we had gathered. "We need to move quickly," Alan said, his voice tense. "Brad's getting desperate, and that makes him even more dangerous. If he knows the feds are closing in, he might do something drastic." "What should I do in the meantime?" I asked, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "Stay close to the hotel," Alan advised. "Don't go anywhere alone, and don't engage with Brad again. We'll handle things from here." As the days went by, the tension only grew. I barely left the hotel, spending most of my time going over the case with Alan and waiting for updates from Gina. The FBI was starting to get involved, but it felt like time was running out. Then, one evening, I received a call from Gina. Her voice was shaky, something I hadn't heard from her before. "Jake, you need to get out of there, now." "What? Why? What's going on?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "There's a hit out on you," Gina said quickly. "I just got word from my contact. Malone's people are coming for you. They know the feds are onto them, and they're tying up loose ends. You need to leave the hotel and go somewhere safe. Don't tell anyone where you're going." My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest. "Where do I go?" "Anywhere but there," Gina replied. "Just get out, and I'll contact you when it's safe." I grabbed the essentials, my wallet, phone, and a small bag I had hastily packed, before bolting out of the hotel. My pulse pounded in my ears as I hurried down the side streets, trying to avoid any crowded areas or familiar faces. Gina's warning echoed in my head. Malone's people were coming for me, and I had no idea how close they were. I had to think fast. The hotel was no longer safe, and if Malone's hitmen were already in town, they might have eyes on all the obvious exits. I couldn't risk going to the airport or taking any of the major highways out of the area. I needed to disappear, at least for a little while, until Gina or Alan could figure out the next steps. I spotted a cab idling by the curb. Without thinking twice, I jumped in and rattled off an address, one that popped into my head as the safest option for now. Take me to the outskirts of town, just past the old highway. Drop me at the first gas station you find, I instructed the driver, doing my best to keep my voice calm. The cab driver raised an eyebrow, clearly sensing my unease, but didn't ask any questions. As the cab sped off, I checked my phone, scrolling through contacts. I needed to stay one step ahead of Brad and Malone's people. But I also had to stay connected to Alan and Gina. For now, I couldn't tell them exactly where I was heading. It was safer that way. We arrived at a rundown gas station just outside the city limits. It wasn't much, an old station with a single pump and a convenience store. But it was isolated. I paid the driver and stepped out, feeling the night air chill my skin. I could still hear the sound of the highway in the distance, but here, I was far from the bustling city. It was quiet. Too quiet. I walked into the convenience store, bought a burner phone, and stepped back outside, keeping an eye on my surroundings. I dialed Gina's number from the new phone. "Jake?" Gina answered almost immediately. "Are you safe?" "I'm out of the hotel," I replied, scanning the empty parking lot. "But I'm off the grid for now. What do we do next?" "Good," Gina said, sounding relieved. "Stay put for now. Don't go anywhere unless absolutely necessary. I'm working on getting you some backup, but it's going to take time. Malone's guys are moving fast, but I've got contacts working on slowing them down." "What about Brad?" I asked, gripping the phone tighter. "Is he still coming after me?" "Brad is desperate, Jake," she said, her voice low. "He knows the feds are closing in, but he's trying to cover his tracks before they can get to him. I wouldn't be surprised if he's working with Malone's people now. You need to be careful. He's not the same guy you met at the resort. He's dangerous." I felt a surge of anger at the mention of Brad. He had manipulated everything, set me up, and now he was trying to have me killed. I wouldn't let him get away with it. "I'm not just going to sit around and wait for them to come after me, Gina," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "We need to take Brad down." "We will," Gina assured me, "but right now, you need to focus on staying alive. Let us handle the rest." I hung up and tossed the burner phone into my bag. My mind raced, trying to think of my next move. I knew Gina was right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, and Brad was getting closer by the minute. Hours passed as I waited at the gas station. Every time a car passed by on the nearby road, my heart would leap into my throat, wondering if this was it, if Malone's people had found me. But the night dragged on without incident, and I started to relax just a little. Suddenly, headlights cut through the darkness, and a black SUV pulled into the parking lot. My pulse quickened, and I ducked behind the corner of the convenience store, watching as the vehicle came to a stop near the pump. Two men stepped out, both wearing dark jackets and scanning the area with cold, calculating eyes. They didn't look like regular customers. My gut told me they were Malone's people. I held my breath, crouching low as they started talking quietly near the car, looking around as if they were searching for something, or someone. I couldn't stay here any longer. I needed to get out, fast. My eyes darted to the back of the convenience store, where a narrow alley led into the woods beyond. If I could make it through the trees, I might be able to lose them in the dark. Taking a deep breath, I made my move, slipping into the shadows as quietly as possible. I moved quickly, but cautiously, staying low as I made my way toward the alley. The crunch of gravel beneath my feet sounded deafening in the silence, but I kept going, my heart pounding in my ears. I glanced back once, just in time to see one of the men pointing in my direction. They had spotted me. "Hey! Stop!" one of them shouted, and I broke into a sprint. I dashed into the alley, my legs burning as I pushed myself harder. Behind me, I could hear the sound of footsteps closing in, and I knew they were gaining on me. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay focused. The woods were just ahead. If I could reach the cover of the trees, I might have a chance. Branches whipped against my face as I crashed into the underbrush, running deeper into the forest. The darkness swallowed me up, and I struggled to find my footing on the uneven ground. But I kept going, my breath ragged, my mind racing. I could still hear them behind me, but their voices were fading. They were having trouble navigating the dense forest, and I realized I might have a chance to lose them. I veered off the main path, ducking behind a large tree and crouching low, trying to quiet my breathing. I waited, listening for any sign of them, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. Minutes passed, and the forest remained silent. I had lost them, at least for now. I collapsed against the tree, my chest heaving with exhaustion. But I couldn't stay here. I needed to keep moving, find somewhere safe. Somewhere Malone's people couldn't find me. I didn't know how long I wandered through the dense woods, the sound of my footsteps barely audible against the soft, damp earth. I had to keep moving, even though my body screamed for rest. Every shadow in the trees seemed like a threat, every distant sound like the footsteps of the men sent to hunt me down. Eventually, I found a clearing with an old, abandoned cabin sitting in the middle of it. The wood was weathered, and the roof sagged in places, but it looked like no one had been there for years. It wasn't ideal, but I needed shelter, and this would do for now. I carefully made my way inside, checking to make sure it was empty. The cabin was sparse, just a few pieces of old furniture and dust covering everything, but it was quiet. I locked the door behind me, barricading it with a heavy chair, and slumped down against the wall, trying to catch my breath. I was safe for now, but the reality of the situation weighed heavily on me. Brad and Malone's people were still out there, hunting me down, and I had no idea how close the FBI was to intervening or whether they'd be able to do so before it was too late. I grabbed the burner phone and dialed Gina's number. It rang several times before she picked up, her voice hushed. "Jake, are you okay?" "I got out," I said, my voice shaky. "I'm in some old cabin in the woods. I lost Malone's men, but I don't know how long I can stay here." Gina sighed in relief. "Thank God. Listen, the FBI is moving, but we're working against the clock. Malone's people are everywhere, and Brad's still in the mix. You need to stay hidden until we get more support." "I can't just sit here, Gina," I said, the frustration clear in my voice. "I need to fight back. Brad set me up and he's still out there." "We'll get him, Jake," Gina said firmly. "But you have to be smart about this. We've got a lead on where Brad's been hiding, and I've got someone tailing him. Just stay low a little longer, and we'll make our move." I leaned my head back against the wall, exhausted, but trying to stay hopeful. "Okay, but hurry." Hours passed as I waited in the cabin, the silence around me both comforting and unnerving. I tried to keep my mind occupied, going over everything that had happened in the last few weeks, replaying the moments that led to this nightmare. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Sarah was gone because of Brad. He had manipulated everything, used me as a pawn, and now he was trying to kill me to tie up loose ends. As night fell, I heard a faint noise outside, a rustling of leaves, the crunch of footsteps. I tensed, my heart racing, and carefully peered through the cracked window. In the darkness, I could make out the faint silhouette of someone approaching the cabin, moving quietly, cautiously. My mind raced. Had Malone's men found me? Was this the end? I grabbed a broken piece of wood, ready to defend myself if it came to that. But just as I braced for the worst, there was a soft knock on the door. "Jake, it's me. Open up," a familiar voice whispered. It was Gina. I quickly removed the chair blocking the door and let her in, my pulse still pounding. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice low and urgent. "I thought you said to stay put." "I did," Gina replied, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "But things are moving fast, and I couldn't risk losing contact with you. Brad's on the run, but we've got his location." "Where is he?" I asked, the tension building inside me. Gina pulled out a map and spread it on the floor. "He's holed up in a private estate not far from here. The FBI is gearing up to raid the place, but they need solid evidence to bring him in." I stared at the map, my mind racing with possibilities. "And you want me to help?" She nodded. "You're the key to this, Jake. Brad thinks you're out of the picture, but if we can get close enough, we might be able to catch him off guard. We just need to buy the feds enough time." An hour later, Gina and I were making our way through the woods toward the location marked on the map. The moonlight barely illuminated the path ahead, but Gina seemed to know exactly where we were going. My mind was focused on one thing: confronting Brad and ending this once and for all. As we approached the estate, I could see the outline of a large house in the distance, surrounded by tall trees and a high fence. Lights flickered in some of the windows, and a couple of armed guards stood watch at the entrance. "This is it," Gina whispered, crouching behind a tree. "Brad's inside. If we can get closer, we might be able to gather enough evidence to lock him up for good." "How do we get in?" I asked, scanning the perimeter. Gina pointed to a section of the fence that looked slightly bent, as if it had been tampered with before. "We slip through there. Once we're inside, we'll need to find a way to get to Brad without being seen." I nodded, adrenaline pumping through my veins. This was it. The moment I'd been waiting for. We moved quietly toward the fence, slipping through the gap and making our way toward the house. The guards didn't seem to notice us, but my heart raced with every step, knowing that one wrong move could blow our cover. As we reached the side of the house, Gina motioned for me to stop. She pressed her ear to the wall, listening intently. "He's in there," she whispered. "Let's go." We slipped inside through a side door, moving silently through the darkened hallways of the house. The sound of voices grew louder as we approached what seemed to be the living room. I could hear Brad's unmistakable voice, speaking to someone, likely one of Malone's men. I peeked around the corner and saw him, sitting casually on a leather sofa, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked relaxed, as if nothing in the world could touch him. But that would change soon enough. I motioned for Gina to stay back as I stepped into the room, my heart pounding in my chest. Brad looked up, startled, his eyes widening as he saw me. "Jake?" he said, setting down his glass. "I thought you were... dead?" I finished for him, my voice cold. "Not yet. But that's what you wanted, wasn't it?" Brad's expression shifted from surprise to anger. "You don't know what you're getting into, Jake. Walk away now, and maybe I'll let you live." I shook my head, stepping closer. "It's over, Brad. The FBI's coming for you. We've got everything we need to take you down." Brad stood up, his fists clenched, but I didn't back down. "You killed Sarah. You set me up, and now you're going to pay for it." For a moment, I thought he might lunge at me, but then a slow smile spread across his face. "You think this ends with me? Malone's going to clean up this mess, Jake. You're just a loose end, and I'm going to make sure he ties you up." Before I could react, Brad lunged for a gun hidden beneath the couch cushions. As soon as Brad lunged for the gun, I reacted on pure instinct. I dove forward, tackling him to the ground before he could pull the trigger. The gun skidded across the floor, and we both scrambled to our feet, locked in a brutal struggle. Brad was stronger than I expected, his punches hard and precise, but my anger fueled me. I wasn't going to let him get away with what he'd done. Not to Sarah, not to me. We crashed into a table, sending glasses and bottles flying. Gina rushed into the room, but I yelled for her to stay back as Brad and I fought for control. He tried to shove me off, but I managed to land a solid punch to his jaw, sending him staggering backward. Just as Brad regained his balance, I heard the unmistakable sound of a gun cocking. I turned to see one of Malone's men entering the room, his weapon aimed directly at me. My heart sank, and for a moment, I thought this was it. I was finished. But before the man could fire, Gina stepped out from behind the doorway and shot him in the shoulder. The man screamed in pain, dropping his gun and collapsing to the ground. I quickly grabbed the weapon, pointing it at Brad as he backed away, his hands raised in surrender. "This is over, Brad," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of adrenaline and fury. "You're not getting out of this." Brad's smug smile was gone, replaced by fear as he realized he was trapped. "You don't understand," he stammered. "Malone, he's not going to let you walk away from this. He'll come for both of us." I took a step closer, the gun steady in my hands. "Then we'll both face him. But you're going down for what you did." Just as I said those words, a new set of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Several FBI agents, led by Gina's contact, burst into the room, guns drawn. One of the agents grabbed Brad, cuffing him as he struggled. "Brad Collins, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder," the agent said coldly as they hauled him to his feet. Brad looked at me one last time, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and desperation. "You think this is over? Malone will find you. You can't run forever, Jake." I stared at him, my grip on the gun tightening for a moment before I handed it to one of the agents. "I'm done running," I replied, my voice steady. "It's your turn now." The agents escorted Brad out of the house, leaving me and Gina standing in the wrecked living room, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. Once Brad was taken into custody, the FBI swept through the estate, gathering evidence and arresting the remaining members of Malone's crew. Gina and I sat on the front steps of the house, watching as the agents finished their work. The night air was cool, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to breathe. "You did it, Jake," Gina said quietly, sitting beside me. "Brad's going down, and the feds are going after Malone next. You're safe now." I glanced at her, grateful for everything she'd done. Without her, I wouldn't have made it this far. But despite the victory, there was still a deep ache inside me, one that wouldn't go away easily. "I couldn't save Sarah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "No matter what happens now, I'll never get her back." Gina placed a hand on my shoulder, her expression softening. "No, you won't. But you did what she would have wanted. You fought for justice. You didn't let Brad win." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink in. Sarah was gone, but I had stopped Brad from hurting anyone else. That had to mean something. In the days that followed, the FBI's case against Brad and Malone unraveled quickly. With the evidence Gina and I had gathered, along with the testimony of several key witnesses, the authorities were able to take down a major part of Malone's operation. Brad, facing a mountain of charges, had no way out. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. As for me, I returned to Austin, trying to pick up the pieces of my life. It wasn't easy. Sarah's absence was a constant weight on my heart, but I found solace in knowing that justice had been served. One afternoon, as I sat in my office, I received a call from Gina. She had been promoted within her firm for her work on the case, and although we hadn't spoken much since the FBI took over, she still checked in on me from time to time. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I'm managing," I said, leaning back in my chair. "It's not easy, but I'm trying to move forward." "You will," she said, her voice reassuring. "You've been through hell, but you came out the other side. That's something to be proud of." I smiled faintly. "Thanks, Gina. I owe you everything." She laughed softly. "Just doing my job, Jake. Take care of yourself, okay? And if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." As the months passed, I began to rebuild my life. It wasn't the life I had imagined with Sarah, but it was a life where I could finally breathe again, free from the shadow of Brad's betrayal and Malone's threats. And in the end, I found peace in knowing that the truth had come out, that justice had prevailed, even in the face of overwhelming odds.